You also mentioned piracy earlier, and you mentioned it in the terms of smalley piracy, which, especially in my old job, and I think a lot of people would recognize that because it makes the news. There's certainly other versions of piracy than just that. And I'm curious if you have any, or if in your reporting you've come across the floating private security operations that piracy has kind of spawned. I'm curious if you could break down how, there's action, reaction, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that has developed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, did you ever get in that space?
I did not personally ever work in that space, but let me tell you, I'm not going to call it a direct pipeline, but there is certainly an avenue for people with my background going into that space.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so I mean, it's a fascinating space. And what I'll say is, on balance, if you look at the height of piracy, Somali piracy, that version of it, 2008, 2010, it's not the 5-6 governments that came together and said, we're going to start cleaning it up and patrolling. That's not really what turned the tide. It is the emergence of this industry, for better and for worse. Like, 4 guys with guns on a mare ship as it rolls through a rough neighborhood is what turned that issue around. Now, so kudos on that. At the same time, that whole industry emerged way out in front of the law and regulation in a space that already is tough to. So how those guys do what they do, and does anyone check over their shoulder that was a legit kill? Like, these are, that's where it gets really thorny, right? When folks get killed out there, they're always going to say they're pirates, just like this slaughter that the first thing they want to say, oh, those guys were pirates. They weren't, they were fishermen. And they can be the same person, but this was not a piracy case. So I spent some time, and actually was about to head back to the Red Sea to do a revisit on these floating armories. You probably know them. That, if you're, so this is the private maritime security market emerged, and it consists of guys with guns. Mostly, the most of them are American, Brit, Australian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan, interesting large number of them, South African. They usually have done a couple tours. They know what they're doing, and now they're kind of branching into this private space. They are usually assigned to 2 to 4 man teams, and they do a tour when the ship is traveling through a rough zone. Now, a lot of heat came on the industry because when the boat carrying those guys with their weapons wanted to come into port, international waters, a lot of those countries were like, no. Your guys are not coming into our national waters with your guns.
Yeah.
So in some places, like in Kenya, they were like dumping them overboard. It was cheaper to just trash the guns and buy new ones. And then these floating armories emerged, which are these weird boats that are one part bunkhouse, one part arms depot. And I spent some time on them, and they're big floating vessels. They're on the high seas, usually a couple miles outside of whatever national line. And they're situated in just a spot where a big vessel is going to enter a rough neighborhood, or it's just leaving a rough neighborhood. And on there, you might have anywhere from 40 to 200 guys, and they wait for their tour. They get dropped off on the armory, they check their weapons, and then they stay there, they get fed. And so I was like, oh, well, that's the place I got to go. If I could get on one of those, I get access to a lot of these guys. I could hear what their experience is, and I could just see this weird, it's like the bar room in Star Wars. It's like this weird, funky place.
Great analogy.
But I spent a bunch of time on them, and it was amazing. It was fascinating. Guys talked very candidly about, how at sea is different than on land, and how thorny things can get, and making judgment calls about when to open fire and when not, and also just certain tensions within their own community about, they're assigned a 4-man team. This guy's from South Africa, and these 3 guys are from wherever, someplace else. Whether there's trust between them, that kind of thing. Whether 4 guys is enough to cover an entire mare ship, which is the size of 2 football fields, like all this sort of stuff. Some of the arms the guys bring that don't even work. Even the questions about, like, if you wanted, this is a hypothetical because I've never seen it really come close to reality, but it's a perfect target for Shabab or ISIS, or like if you're going to rob a store, one of those armories would be great. Yeah, you got a lot of guys that'll shoot back, but they got to check their arms. And if you sneak up on them, that's a motherload of weaponry. So I've always wondered, like, when is that going to happen? That, one of these armories in the Red Sea is going to get attacked so that they could get all the arms, but it's never happened that I know of. But yeah, so that the scene is really calmed down a little bit. Obviously, the Houthi thing in the Yemen situation has kicked it back up, and that's why I was going to head back out with one of those guys I met on the first reporting of that, private maritime security guy who runs his own little firm. He was going to take me out to a bunch of armories. I just needed a break from travel, so I stepped back. But it's a really fascinating scene. And what's interesting is, I don't know how your age, but it's a lot of guys like my age. I'm 52, and a lot of these guys are from 40 to 55, and they're kind of just like eking out the last phase of earnings.
Well, the military is a great thing for a lot of people. You can come into any branch of the military, you're going to get vocational training, you're going to get job skills. If you go into the special operations pipeline, you get an immense amount of training. You get incredible equipment. But finding a role in the civilian sector that you can kind of just seamlessly transfer into.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.